This woman's name is Roxy, and she's 28 years old. On what should have been a romantic second date, she shared news that would change everything. She was carrying a child, 4 months along. Within minutes, the warmth in his eyes turned to ice. Within days, he'd erased her from his life completely. And somehow, in a twist she never saw coming, she became the villain of the story. But before you judge her, before you decide who's right and who's wrong, let me tell you how a woman trying to rebuild her shattered life became the target of whispers, accusations, and a social media storm that cost her everything. I'm Emma, and this is a story about second chances, impossible choices, and the harsh reality of dating when your life doesn't fit into someone else's perfect picture. Roxy's world had already crumbled before any of this began. Picture this. Standing in your bathroom, your husband's phone in your trembling hands, reading messages that confirm your worst nightmare. The man you trusted, the one you'd built a life with, had been sharing his bed and his promises with someone else for months. The texts from Jared's coworker were brutal in their honesty. She called Roxy boring, predictable, a woman who'd let herself go. Every word was a knife, and Roxy read them all while the shower ran and her husband hummed, completely unaware that his double life had just been exposed. The divorce came swiftly after that. Lawyers, paperwork, the division of a life they'd built together. Jared showed no remorse, only frustration that he'd been caught. He moved out within 2 weeks, leaving Roxy alone in an apartment that echoed with memories and broken promises. Then came the nausea. At first, she thought it was stress. Who wouldn't feel sick after their marriage exploded? But when the feeling persisted, when her clothes started fitting differently, reality hit her like a freight train. A pregnancy test confirmed what her body had been trying to tell her. She was 4 months pregnant with Jared's baby. 4 months. Which meant it had happened right before everything fell apart, back when she still believed in their future together. The irony was suffocating. She was carrying the child of a man who'd already moved on, who was probably celebrating his freedom while she faced single motherhood alone. Her friends rallied around her the best they could. They took her out, reminded her that life existed beyond the wreckage of her marriage. Her close friend Jessica worked with a man named Richard, someone who always seemed to know people. Richard took it upon himself to play matchmaker, insisting he knew someone perfect for Roxy, a stable, genuine man named Connor, who'd treat her the way she deserved. At first, Roxy resisted. The idea of dating while pregnant, while still processing her husband's betrayal, felt impossible. But loneliness has a way of changing your perspective. Late at night, she'd lie awake wondering if this was it. If being a divorced, pregnant 28-year-old meant she'd missed her window for love. Would any decent man want someone carrying another man's child? Someone whose life was this messy? The fear became overwhelming. Not just fear of being alone, but fear of being seen as damaged goods, as someone whose complications made her unlovable. She needed proof that she still had value, that someone could look at her and see more than just her circumstances. So when Richard finally arranged for her to meet Connor at a casual work event, Roxy said yes. She needed this. Not just a date, but hope. Connor was 27, with kind eyes and an easy smile that didn't seem forced or rehearsed. He worked in project management, talked about his job with genuine enthusiasm, and had this calm presence that made Roxy feel less like she was performing and more like she was just being herself. When he approached her at the gathering, there was no awkward pickup line, no obvious agenda. Just a simple introduction and a question about what she did for work. They fell into conversation naturally, and for the first time in months, Roxy laughed without feeling guilty about it. Connor asked her out before the evening ended. Nothing presumptuous, just coffee, a chance to talk without the noise of other people around them. Roxy felt something flutter in her chest, something she'd thought had died completely. Hope. Their first date exceeded every expectation. They met at a cozy downtown coffee shop on a Wednesday afternoon. The conversation flowed effortlessly, from terrible first jobs to favorite childhood movies to the kind of dreams you usually keep to yourself. Connor listened in a way Jared never had, asked follow-up questions, remembered details from earlier in the conversation. 3 hours passed like 30 minutes. When they finally stood to leave, Connor walked her to her car, his hands in his pockets, a slightly nervous smile on his face. He asked if she'd want to do this again, maybe dinner next time. Roxy heard herself say yes before she'd even processed the question. Driving home, she felt lighter than she had in months. The divorce, the pregnancy, the uncertainty, none of it disappeared. But for a few hours, she'd been able to exist outside of it. She'd been seen as Roxy, not as the broken wife or the pregnant burden. Just Roxy. That night, Connor sent her a text. "I had an amazing time today. Already looking forward to Friday." She read it 3 times, smiling each time, feeling something she'd almost forgotten existed. But underneath that smile, guilt gnawed at her. She was showing now, not obviously to strangers, but enough that she had to carefully choose her clothes. The loose sweater she'd worn to coffee, the way she'd positioned her purse in front of her stomach when they stood, these were calculated choices, and she knew it. She told herself she'd reveal everything on the second date. She just needed this one moment of normalcy first, this one experience of being wanted without the weight of her situation pressing down on everything. Was that really so wrong? Friday arrived with a mixture of excitement and dread. Roxy changed outfits 4 times, each one an attempt to look attractive while concealing what she wasn't ready to reveal. She settled on a flowing top with jeans, checking her profile in the mirror repeatedly, wondering if he'd notice, if he already suspected. The restaurant Connor chose was casual and warm, with low lighting and comfortable booths. He was waiting when she arrived, which she appreciated. It showed he cared enough to be early. They ordered appetizers and fell back into easy conversation, picking up threads from their first date. Connor told her about a hiking trip he was planning, asked if she enjoyed being outdoors. She found herself nodding, imagining a version of herself that could go on camping trips and nature walks. Even though she knew that version wouldn't exist for at least another year, maybe longer. But as the evening progressed, the deception started feeling heavier. Every laugh felt dishonest. Every shared story felt like building on a foundation of omission. And physically, she could feel the difference in her body. The way her shirt pulled, the way sitting certain ways made her stomach more prominent. She couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't go on a third date wearing progressively baggier clothes, hoping he wouldn't notice, waiting for the right moment that might never come. If there was going to be something real between them, it had to start with honesty. Connor was mid-sentence, describing a project at work, when Roxy interrupted him. "Connor, there's something important I need to tell you." His expression shifted from animated to attentive, sensing the change in her tone. "I'm pregnant. 4 months along." The silence that followed felt like falling. Connor's face went blank, not angry or disgusted, just stunned, like his mind was trying to process information that didn't fit with what he'd expected from this evening. Roxy rushed to fill the silence with explanations. The divorce that was still being finalized, Jared's affair, how she wasn't looking for someone to step into a father role or take on responsibilities that weren't theirs, how she'd just wanted him to get to know her first, to see her as a person before everything got complicated. Connor asked questions, practical ones about timing, about her plans, about the father's involvement. But his whole demeanor had shifted. The easy warmth was gone, replaced by something polite but distant. He kept glancing at his phone, looking toward the door, giving all the nonverbal cues of someone planning their exit. Roxy tried to salvage the conversation, emphasizing that she wasn't expecting anything from him, that she just wanted to continue getting to know each other honestly. But you can't unring a bell. The revelation had changed everything, and they both knew it. When the check arrived, Connor paid quickly, too quickly. The walk to her car was excruciating, filled with her attempts at small talk and his monosyllabic responses. When they reached her vehicle, she forced herself to ask the question, even though she already knew the answer. "Would you want to see me again?" Connor's response was careful, practiced. He wasn't ready for the responsibility of being involved with someone in her situation. It wasn't personal. He just wasn't in that place in his life right now. The words were kind, but the message was clear. She was too complicated, too much, too risky. Roxy smiled and said she understood. But inside, something broke all over again. This was exactly what she'd feared. That revealing her reality would make her unwantable, that no man could see past the pregnancy to the person carrying it. She drove home in silence, tears blurring the streetlights into golden smears. 3 days of silence followed. Roxy checked her phone obsessively, hoping for a text that never came. Some small part of her had believed that Connor would think it over and reach back out, that their connection had been strong enough to overcome her circumstances. But by the fourth day, she accepted the truth. He was gone, and he wasn't coming back. What she didn't expect was the phone call from Richard. His voice carried frustration as he asked what had happened, why Connor had told him things weren't going to work out. Richard had invested social capital into this introduction, and now he felt like Roxy had made him look bad. When she explained about the pregnancy revelation, Richard's tone shifted. He became defensive of Connor, explaining that not everyone was prepared for that kind of situation, that Connor was a good person who simply knew what he wanted. Then came the question that made Roxy's blood boil. Why didn't you tell him up front? The implication was clear. This was her fault. She'd withheld crucial information, misled him, essentially trapped him into 2 dates under false pretenses. Never mind that she'd been completely honest about who she was as a person. Never mind that the pregnancy didn't change her personality, her interests, her values. The only thing that mattered, apparently, was that she hadn't led with her most complicated truth. Richard went on to mention that Connor had been talking to coworkers about the situation, feeling misled and uncertain how to process it. The narrative was already being written, and in it, Roxy was the deceptive one, the woman with ulterior motives, the pregnant stranger who'd tried to trap a nice guy into something he didn't want. The conversation ended badly, with Richard suggesting that maybe if she'd been upfront from the beginning, Connor would have been more receptive, as if there was some magical way to announce, "I'm divorced and pregnant," that would make a man eager to date her. After hanging up, Roxy sat in stunned anger. She'd been honest, just not instantly. She'd wanted to be seen as a person first, a whole human being with thoughts and interests and a personality, before being reduced to her circumstances. Was that really manipulative? Was that really wrong? The worst part was imagining Connor at his office, receiving sympathetic nods and understanding murmurs, while painting himself as the victim of some pregnancy ambush. Because that's always how these stories got told, wasn't it? The woman was calculating, the man was blindsided, and nobody ever considered that maybe, just maybe. She'd been trying to navigate an impossible situation with limited good options. Over the following week, Roxy's disappointment curdled into anger. She replayed that dinner endlessly in her mind. How engaged Connor had been until the moment of revelation. How quickly he'd transformed her from someone interesting into someone problematic. She was the same person before and after that sentence, but suddenly she'd become too much to handle. Her friends mostly supported her, agreeing that Connor had been shallow and short-sighted. If he'd genuinely been interested, wouldn't he at least give it a chance? See where things went? She wasn't asking him to raise another man's child. She was asking him to continue getting to know her. But apparently, even that was too much responsibility. Then came the grocery store encounter with Richard. Casual conversation, polite small talk, until Richard mentioned that Connor had started dating someone new. Someone from his gym, Richard said. Drama-free situation, you know? Drama-free. As if being pregnant made her dramatic. As if surviving infidelity and divorce was somehow character flaw, rather than circumstance. Roxy smiled and congratulated Richard on Connor's new relationship, but internally, she was seething. Connor could move on immediately, could find someone who fit his criteria for uncomplicated, but she was supposed to accept that her reality made her unworthy of patience or understanding. That seemed fundamentally unfair. That's when Roxy decided she needed closure, not for him, but for herself. She got Connor's number from Richard under false pretenses, claiming she had something of his to return. When she texted asking to talk briefly, he agreed, probably expecting an apology or perhaps a final plea. They met at a coffee shop near his office. Connor looked uncomfortable from the moment he sat down, and Roxy took some satisfaction in that. She'd come prepared with exactly what she wanted to say. She explained that she understood he wasn't interested, but she wanted him to recognize how his reaction had affected her. She hadn't been trying to deceive him. She'd simply wanted him to know her as a person before revealing her complications. That seemed reasonable to her, and she'd hoped it would seem reasonable to him too. Connor immediately became defensive, insisting he'd never accused her of deception, that he just wasn't ready for that kind of involvement. When Roxy pressed him on what that kind of situation meant, he fumbled through explanations about complexity and emotional readiness. She pointed out the obvious contradiction. He'd been perfectly fine with her for 2 dates before learning about the pregnancy. The only thing that changed was his knowledge, not her actual personality or who she was as a person. He had no good response to that. Then Roxy mentioned his new relationship, the drama-free gym girlfriend. Connor's face flushed as he insisted that wasn't her business. She agreed. It wasn't. Just like her pregnancy wasn't really his business after 2 dates. But apparently, they both felt entitled to judge each other's choices. The conversation ended tensely. Roxy left feeling slightly vindicated, but also exhausted. She'd said what she needed to say, and now she could move on. Except she couldn't. Connor's dismissal kept bothering her, the way he'd acted like she was being unreasonable for wanting basic respect and honesty. So she started checking his social media, not obsessively, just occasionally, to see what Mr. Drama-Free was up to with his perfect new relationship. Within 2 weeks, the photos started appearing. Connor and his gym girlfriend at the beach, at dinner, living the carefree relationship highlight reel. The same man who'd claimed he wasn't ready for complicated situations was apparently very ready for someone who checked all his boxes. It made her physically ill, watching him perform happiness while she dealt with morning sickness and divorce paperwork alone. When she commented on one of his photos, just 2 words, "looks fun," with a smiley face, he deleted it within an hour and sent her a text asking her not to contact him or comment on his posts anymore. That pushed Roxy over the edge. She screenshot his text and posted it on Facebook with a caption. "When you politely comment on someone's public post and they act like you're stalking them." She didn't name him or tag him, but their mutual connections knew exactly who she meant. The post generated supportive comments from her friends, validating her frustration. But Richard saw it, and he was furious. He called her, accusing her of being inappropriate, of harassing Connor, of punishing him for being honest about his boundaries. Their argument escalated quickly. Richard insisted Connor was a good guy who didn't deserve to be publicly criticized for his dating choices. Roxy countered that if Connor didn't want people commenting on his behavior, maybe he shouldn't behave badly. Rejecting someone for being pregnant and then immediately dating someone else sent a pretty clear message about his character. Richard shot back that maybe Connor would have been more open if she'd been upfront from the beginning. As if transparency would have changed anything. As if there was some magical way to announce her circumstances that would have made her acceptable to him. The conversation ended with Richard threatening to distance himself from the situation, treating Roxy like an unstable ex rather than someone who'd been on 2 dates and had legitimate feelings about how she'd been treated. But that threat only strengthened Roxy's resolve. Why should she protect Connor's comfort when he'd made no effort to consider hers? 3 months later, Roxy's life fell apart in ways she never anticipated. The divorce finalized, but the settlement was devastatingly small. Jared's attorney had outmaneuvered hers, leaving Roxy with barely enough to cover rent on a modest 1-bedroom apartment, let alone prepare for a baby. Her employer cut her hours due to slow business, and suddenly single motherhood was approaching with no financial safety net beneath her. But the real devastation came from an unexpected direction. Richard had been talking, spinning stories about Roxy's obsessive behavior with Connor. Her Facebook post and their arguments had been transformed into a narrative about an unstable pregnant woman who couldn't handle rejection gracefully. Word traveled through professional networks the way it always does. Someone who knew Roxy's boss. Suddenly, she was being pulled into meetings about personal issues affecting workplace relationships. She tried explaining that it was a private matter, completely separate from work, but the damage was done. They started documenting everything, her medical appointments, any personal calls, her mood on difficult pregnancy days. When they finally terminated her employment, they cited performance issues, but everyone understood the real reason. The drama with Connor and Richard had made her a liability. Unemployed, pregnant, barely divorced, and somehow the villain in everyone's story. That was Roxy's new reality. Meanwhile, Connor thrived. Through mutual friends, she heard about his promotion, his move-in with the drama-free girlfriend. The man who couldn't handle 2 dates with a complicated woman was apparently ready for serious commitment with someone who fit his acceptable criteria. Job hunting while visibly pregnant proved nearly impossible, especially with questionable references. Roxy took whatever retail positions she could find, barely covering her basic expenses. The stress affected her pregnancy. Elevated blood pressure, constant anxiety, inadequate prenatal care she could barely afford. 6 months after her daughter was born, Roxy was working 2 part-time jobs just to survive. Her baby was healthy, thank everything, but Roxy was exhausted, broke, and more isolated than she'd ever been. Jared had completely disappeared after the divorce, claiming poverty while somehow affording vacations with his new girlfriend. And Connor's life kept improving. Social media updates showed promotions, vacations, eventually an engagement announcement. Everything Roxy had hoped her life would become was happening for him instead. The cruelest part was how people talked about it, how Connor had dodged a bullet by not getting involved with her. As if her struggles proved he'd made the wise choice. As if complications should disqualify someone from love and support. Nobody considered that maybe if he'd been the decent man everyone claimed, if he'd stayed and supported her, her life might have taken a different path. Here's what keeps Roxy awake at night. Everyone talks about respecting Connor's choice, his honesty about what he wanted, his right to date whomever he pleased. But what about her choice? What about her desire to be with someone who could handle real life instead of running when things got complicated? Nobody talks about that. Nobody discusses how his rejection triggered a spiral that affected every aspect of her existence. She's not claiming it's entirely his fault. Life is complex, and many things went wrong. But she'll never forgive him for being a coward when she needed someone to take a chance on her. And honestly, she doesn't feel guilty about calling him out. Some people deserve to be held accountable for how they treat others, even if it makes them uncomfortable. If Connor wanted a simple, drama-free life, he should have been explicit about his requirements from the start. Only women with spotless histories need apply. But he didn't get to act interested in her, to make her feel seen and valued, and then disappear the moment he discovered she was human, with a human life that included complications. This is Roxy's story, a story about impossible choices, harsh judgments, and the way society treats women who don't fit into neat, uncomplicated categories. Whether you think she was wrong to wait before revealing her pregnancy, whether you think Connor was justified in his reaction, that's for you to decide. But remember this, behind every drama-free requirement is someone else's pain being dismissed as inconvenient. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about the choices people make when they're desperate for connection, please hit that like button. Share this video with friends who need to hear it. We all know someone navigating impossible situations while being judged for how they survive them. And subscribe to Mrs. Emma's channel to stay updated on more stories like this. Real, raw, complicated stories about real people facing impossible choices. Don't miss the next one. Until then, remember, everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about. Choose empathy. I'm Emma, and I'll see you in the next story.